F. Factor C. Facteur C. Lacan coined the term Factor C at a psychiatric congress in 1950. Factor C is a constant characteristic of any given cultural milieu. It is an attempt to designate that part of the symbolic order which marks the particular features of one culture as opposed to another. C stands for culture. Although it would be interesting to speculate on the possible applications of this concept to the interrelationship between different cultural milieus and psychoanalysis, Lacan only gives one example of the C factor, ahistorism. He argues is the C factor of the culture of the United States. The American way of life revolves around such signifiers as happiness, adaptation, human relations, and human engineering. Lacan regards the C factor of United States culture as particularly antithetical to psychoanalysis and sees it as largely responsible for the errors which have beset psychoanalytic theory in the USA, such as ego psychology. Fantasy, fantasme. The concept of fantasy, spelled fantasy in the Standard Edition, is central to Freud's work. Indeed, the origin of psychoanalysis is bound up with Freud's recognition in 1897 that memories of seduction are sometimes the product of fantasy rather than traces of a real sexual abuse. This crucial moment in the development of Freud's thought, which is often simplistically dubbed the abandonment of the seduction theory, seems to imply that fantasy is opposed to reality, a purely illusory product of the imagination which stands in the way of a correct perception of reality. However, such a view of fantasy cannot be maintained in psychoanalytic theory, since reality is not seen as an unproblematic given in which there is a single objectively correct way of perceiving, but as something which is itself discursively constructed. Therefore, the change in Freud's ideas in 1897 does not imply a rejection of the veracity of all memories of sexual abuse, but the discovery of the fundamentally discursive and imaginative nature of memory. Memories of past events are continually being reshaped in accordance with unconscious desires, so much so that symptoms originate not in any supposed objective facts, but in a complex dialectic in which fantasy plays a vital role. Freud uses the term fantasy then to denote a scene which is presented to the imagination and which stages an unconscious desire. The subject invariably plays a part in this scene even when this is not immediately apparent. The fantasized scene may be conscious or unconscious. When unconscious, the analyst must reconstruct it on the basis of other clues. While Lacan accepts Freud's formulations on the importance of fantasy and on its visual quality as a scenario which stages desire, he emphasizes the protective function of fantasy. Lacan compares the fantasy scene to a frozen image on a cinema screen. Just as the film may be stopped at a certain point in order to avoid showing a traumatic scene which follows, so also the fantasy scene is a defense which veils castration. The fantasy is thus characterized by a fixed and immobile quality. Although fantasy only emerges as a significant term in Lacan's work from 1957 on, the concept of a relatively stable mode of defense is evident earlier on. See, for example, Lacan's remark in 1951 on the permanent modes by which the subject constitutes his objects. This concept is at the root both of Lacan's idea of fantasy and of his notion of clinical structure. Both are conceived of as a relatively stable way of defending oneself against castration, against the lack in the big other. Each clinical structure may thus be distinguished by the particular way in which it uses a fantasy scene to veil the lack in the big other. The neurotic fantasy, which Lacan formalizes in the matheme as Barthes in relation to object A, appears in the graph of desire as the subject's response to the enigmatic desire of the big other, a way of answering the question about what the big other wants from me, que voy. The matheme is to be read the Barthes subject in relation to the object. The perverse fantasy inverts this relation to the object and is thus formalized as object A in relation to as Barthes. Although the matheme as Barthes in relation to object A designates the general structure of the neurotic fantasy, Lacan also provides more specific formulas for the fantasy of the hysteric and that of the obsessional neurotic. While the various formulas of fantasy indicate the common features of the fantasies of those who share the same clinical structure, the analyst must also attend to the unique features which characterize each patient's particular phantasmatic scenario. These unique features express the subject's particular mode of jouissance, though in a distorted way. The distortion evident in the fantasy marks it as a compromise formation. The fantasy is thus both that which enables the subject to sustain his desire, and that by which the subject sustains himself at the level of his vanishing desire. Lacan holds that beyond all the myriad images which appear in dreams and elsewhere, there is always one fundamental fantasy, which is unconscious. In the course of psychoanalytic treatment, the analyst reconstructs the analysant's fantasy in all its details. However, the treatment does not stop there. The analysant must go on to traverse the fundamental fantasy. In other words, the treatment must produce some modification of the subject's fundamental mode of defense, some alteration in his mode of jouissance. Although Lacan recognizes the power of the image in fantasy, he insists that this is due not to any intrinsic quality of the image in itself, but to the place which it occupies in a symbolic structure. The fantasy is always an image set to work in a signifying structure. Lacan criticizes the Lacanian account of fantasy for not taking this symbolic structure fully into account and thus remaining at the level of the imaginary. Any attempt to reduce fantasy to the imagination is a permanent misconception. In the 1960s, Lacan devotes a whole year of his seminar to discussing what he calls the logic of fantasy, again stressing the importance of the signifying structure in fantasy. Father, Père. From very early on in his work, Lacan lays great importance on the role of the father in psychic structure. In his 1938 article on the family, he attributes the importance of the Oedipus complex to the fact that it combines in the figure of the father two almost conflicting functions: the protective function and the prohibitive function. He also points to the contemporary social decline in the paternal imago, clearly visible in the images of absent fathers and humiliated fathers, as the cause of current psychopathological peculiarities. The father continues to be a constant theme of Lacan's work thereafter. Lacan's emphasis on the importance of the father can be seen as a reaction against the tendency of Kleinian psychoanalysis and object relations theory to place the mother-child relation at the heart of psychoanalytic theory. In opposition to this tendency, Lacan continually stresses the role of the father as a third term who, by mediating the imaginary dual relation between the mother and the child, saves the child from psychosis and makes possible an entry into social existence. The father is thus more than a mere rival with whom the subject competes for the mother's love. He is the representative of the social order as such, and only by identifying with the father in the Oedipus complex can the subject gain entry into this order. The absence of the father is therefore an important factor in the aetiology of all psychopathological structures. However, the father is not a simple concept, but a complex one which begs the question of what exactly is meant by the term father. Lacan argues that the that the question, what is a father, forms the central theme which runs throughout Freud's entire work. It is in order to answer this question that from 1953 on, Lacan stresses the importance of distinguishing between the symbolic father, the imaginary father, and the real father. The symbolic father. The symbolic father is not a real being, but a position, a function, and hence is synonymous with the term paternal function. This function is none other than that of imposing the law and regulating desire in the Oedipus complex, of intervening in the imaginary dual relationship between mother and child to introduce a necessary symbolic distance between them. The true function of the father is fundamentally to unite and not to set in opposition a desire and the law. Although the symbolic father is not an actual subject but a position in the symbolic order, a subject may nevertheless come to occupy this position. By virtue of exercising the paternal function, nobody can ever occupy this position completely. However, the symbolic father does not usually intervene by virtue of someone incarnating this function, but in a veiled fashion, for example by being mediated by the discourse of the mother. The symbolic father is the fundamental element in the structure of the symbolic order. What distinguishes the symbolic order of culture from the imaginary order of nature is the inscription of a line of male descendants. By structuring descendants into a series of generations, patrilineality introduces an order whose structure is different from the natural order. The symbolic father is also the dead father, the father of the primal horde who has been murdered by his own sons. The symbolic father is also referred to as the name of the father. The presence of the imaginary phallus as a third term in the pre-Oedipal imagery triangle indicates that the symbolic father is already functioning at the pre-Oedipal stage. Behind the symbolic mother there is always the symbolic father. The psychotic, however, does not even get this far. Indeed, it is the absence of the symbolic father which characterizes the essence of the psychotic structure. See foreclosure. The imaginary father. The imaginary father is an imago, the composite of all the imaginary constructs that the subject builds up in fantasy around the figure of the father. This imaginary construction often bears little relationship to the father as he is in reality. The imaginary father can be construed as an ideal father, or the opposite, as the father who has fucked the kid up. In the former guise, the imaginary father is the prototype of God figures in religions and all-powerful protector. In the latter role, the imaginary father is both the terrifying father of the primal horde who imposes the incest taboo on his sons and the agent of privation, the father whom the daughter blames for depriving her of the symbolic phallus or its equivalent, a child. In both guises, though, whether as the ideal father or as the cruel agent of privation, the imaginary father is seen as omnipotent. Psychosis and perversion both involve in different ways a reduction of the symbolic father to the imaginary father. The real father. While Lacan is quite clear in defining what he means by imaginary father and the symbolic father, his remarks on the real father are quite obscure. Lacan's only unequivocal formulation is that the real father is the agent of castration, the one who performs the operation of symbolic castration. Apart from this, Lacan gives few other clues about what he means by the phrase. In 1960, he describes the real father as the one who effectively occupies the mother, the great fucker. And he even goes on to say in 1970 that the real father is the spermatozoon, though he immediately qualifies this statement with the remark that nobody has ever thought of himself as the son of a spermatozoon. On the basis of these comments, it seems possible to argue that the real father is the biological father of the subject. However, since a degree of uncertainty always surrounds the question of who the biological father really is, pater semper incertus est, while the mother is certissima, Freud, it would be more precise to say that the real father is the man who is said to be the subject's biological father. The real father is thus an effect of language, and it is in this sense that the adjective real is to be understood here, the real of language rather than the real of biology. The real father plays a crucial role in the Oedipus complex. It is he who intervenes in the third time of the Oedipus complex as the one who castrates the child. See castration complex. This intervention saves the child from the preceding anxiety. Without it, the child requires a phobic object as a symbolic substitute for the absent real father. The intervention of the real father as agent of castration is not simply equivalent to his physical presence in the family. As the case of little Hans indicates, the real father may be physically present and yet fail to intervene as agent of castration. Conversely, the intervention of the real father may well be felt by the child even when the father is physically absent. Fetishism, fetishisme. The term fetish first came into widespread use in the 18th century in context of the study of primitive religions, in which it denoted an inanimate object of worship, an etymology which Lacan believes is important. In the 19th century, Marx borrowed the term to describe the way that in capitalist societies, social relations assume the illusory form of relations between things, commodity fetishism. It was Krafft-Ebing who, in the last decade of the 19th century, first applied the term to sexual behavior. He defined fetishism as a sexual perversion in which sexual excitement is absolutely dependent on the presence of a specific object, the fetish. It is this definition that Freud and most other writers on sexuality have adopted since. The fetish is usually an inanimate object such as a shoe or piece of underwear. Freud argued that fetishism, seen as an almost exclusively male perversion, originates in the child's horror of female castration. Confronted with the mother's lack of a penis, the fetishist disavows his lack and finds an object, the fetish, as a symbolic substitute for the mother's missing penis. In Lacan's first approach to the subject of fetishism in 1956, he argues that fetishism is a particularly important area of study and bemoans its neglect by his contemporaries. He stresses that the equivalence between the fetish and the maternal phallus can only be understood by reference to linguistic transformations and not by reference to vague analogies in the visual field, such as comparisons between fur and pubic hair. He cites Freud's analysis of the phrase Glanz auf der Nase as support for his argument. In the following years, as Lacan develops his distinction between the penis and phallus, he emphasizes that the fetish is a substitute for the latter, not the former. Lacan also extends the mechanism of disavowal, making it the operation constitutive of perversion itself and not just of the fetishistic perversion. However, he retains Freud's view that fetishism is an exclusively male perversion, or at least extremely rare among women. In the seminar of 1956-1957, Lacan elaborates an important distinction between the fetish object and the phobic object. Whereas the fetish is a symbolic substitute for the mother's missing phallus, the phobic object is an imaginary substitute for symbolic castration. See phobia. Like all perversions, fetishism is rooted in the pre-Oedipal triangle of mother-child phallus. However, it is unique in that it involves both identification with mother and with the imaginary phallus. Indeed, in fetishism, the subject oscillates between these two identifications. Lacan's statement in 1958 that the penis takes on the value of a fetish for heterosexual women raises a number of interesting questions. Firstly, it reverses Freud's views on fetishism rather than the fetish being a symbolic substitute for the real penis. The real penis may itself become a fetish by substituting the woman's absent symbolic phallus. Secondly, it undermines the claims made by both Freud and Lacan that fetishism is extremely rare among women. If the penis can be considered a fetish, then fetishism is clearly far more prevalent among women than among men. Forclusion. From his doctoral dissertation in 1932 on, one of the central quests which animates Lacan's work is that of identifying a specific psychical cause for psychosis. In the course of addressing this problem, two themes are constant. The exclusion of the father. As early as 1938, Lacan relates the origin of psychosis to an exclusion of the father from the family structure, with a consequent reduction of the latter to mother-child relations. Later on in his work, when Lacan distinguishes between the real, imaginary, and symbolic father, he specifies that it is the absence of the symbolic father which is linked to psychosis. The Freudian concept of Verwerfung. Freud uses the term Verwerfung, translated as repudiation in the Standard Edition, in a number of disparate ways, see Laplanche and Pontalis, but Lacan focuses on one in particular, namely the sense of a specific defense mechanism which is distinct from repression, Verdrängung, in which the ego rejects the incompatible idea together with its affects and behaves as if the idea had never occurred to the ego at all. In 1954, basing himself on a reading of the Wolfman case history, Lacan identifies Verwerfung as the specific mechanism of psychosis in which an element is rejected outside the symbolic order, just as if it had never existed. At this time, Lacan proposes various ways of translating the term Verwerfung into French, rendering it as rejet, refus, and retranchement. It is not until 1956 that Lacan proposes the term foreclusion, a term in use in the French legal system, in English foreclosure, as the best way of translating Verwerfung into French. It is this term that Lacan continues to use for the rest of his work. In 1954, when Lacan first turns to the Freudian concept of Verwerfung in his research for a specific mechanism for psychosis, it is not clear exactly what is repudiated. It can be castration that is repudiated, or speech itself, or the genital plane. Lacan finds a solution to the problem at the end of 1957 when he proposes the idea that it is the name of the father, a fundamental signifier that is the object of foreclosure. In this way, Lacan is able to combine in one formula both of the themes that had previously dominated his thinking on the causality of psychosis, the absence of the father and the concept of Verwerfung. This formula remains at the heart of Lacan's thinking on psychosis throughout the rest of his work. When the name of the father is foreclosed for a particular subject, it leaves a hole in the symbolic order which can never be filled. The subject can then be said to have a psychotic structure, even if he shows none of the classical signs of psychosis. Sooner or later, when the foreclosed name of the father reappears in the real, the subject is unable to assimilate it, and the result of this collision with the inassimilable signifier is the entry into psychosis proper, characterized typically by the onset of hallucinations and/or delusions. Foreclosure is to be distinguished from other operations such as repression, negation, and projection. Repression. Foreclosure differs from repression in that the foreclosed element is not buried in the unconscious, but expelled from the unconscious. Repression is the operation which constitutes neurosis, whereas foreclosure is the operation which constitutes psychosis. Negation. Foreclosure differs from negation in that it involves no initial judgment of existence, see Bejahung, whereas negation involves the denial of some element whose existence has previously been registered. With foreclosure, it is as if the foreclosed element had never existed at all. Projection. Foreclosure is a specifically psychotic mechanism, whereas for Lacan, projection is a purely neurotic mechanism, and whereas with projection the direction of the process is from inside to outside, with foreclosure the foreclosed element returns from outside. Freud had noted this in psychoanalytic notes on an autobiographical account of a case of paranoia, where he wrote of Schreber's hallucinations. It was incorrect to say that the perception which was suppressed internally is projected outwards. The truth is rather, as we see now, that what was abolished internally returns from without. Lacan not only quotes this sentence of Freud's, but also rephrases it in his own terms. Whatever is refused in the symbolic order reappears in the real. In 1957, Lacan briefly links the term Verwerfung to the mechanism by which the superego is produced via identification with the father in the dissolution of the Oedipus complex. This is clearly not a psychotic mechanism of foreclosure, but a normal neurotic process. Formation. The formations of the unconscious are those phenomena in which the laws of the unconscious are most clearly visible. The joke, the dream, the symptom, and the lapsus, parapraxis. The fundamental mechanisms involved in the formations of the unconscious were referred to by Freud as the laws of the unconscious condensation and displacement, which Lacan redefines as metaphor and metonymy. The formation of the formation of analysts, formation des analystes, means the training of psychoanalysts. The formations of the ego are the three elements related to the ego, the superego, the ideal ego, and the ego ideal. Founding speech, parole fondant. The term founding speech, sometimes rendered foundational speech, emerges in Lacan's work at the time of his growing attention to language in the early 1950s. The point Lacan draws attention to in his use of this term is the way that speech can radically transform both the speaker and the addressee in the act of utterance. Lacan's two favorite examples of this are the phrases "you are my master, teacher, maître," and "you are my wife," which serve to position the speaker as pupil and husband respectively. In other words, the crucial aspect of founding speech is that it not only transforms the other but also transforms the subject. Founding speech which envelops the subject is everything that has constituted him, his parents, his neighbors, the whole structure of his community, and not only constituted him as symbol, but constituted him in his being. Lacan refers to the same function of speech as elective speech in the seminar of 1955-1956 and as votive speech in the seminar of 1956-1957. Lacan plays on the homophony between "tu es ma mère," you are my mother, and "tu es ma mère," to kill my mother, to illustrate the way that a founding speech addressed to the other may reveal a repressed murderous desire. Fragmented body, corps morcelé. The notion of the fragmented body is one of the earliest original concepts to appear in Lacan's work and is closely linked to the concept of the mirror stage. In the mirror stage, the infant sees its reflection in the mirror as a whole synthesis, and this perception causes by contrast the perception of his own body, which lacks motor coordination at this stage, as divided and fragmented. The anxiety provoked by this feeling of fragmentation fuels the identification with the specular image by which the ego is formed. However, the anticipation of a synthetic ego is henceforth constantly threatened by the memory of this sense of fragmentation, which manifests itself in images of castration, emasculation, mutilation, dismemberment, dislocation, evisceration, devouring, bursting open of the body, which haunt the human imagination. These images typically appear in the analysant's dreams and associations at a particular phase in the treatment, namely, the moment when the analysant's aggressivity emerges in the negative transference. This moment is an important early sign that the treatment is progressing in the right direction, in other words, towards the disintegration of the rigid unity of the ego. In a more general sense, the fragmented body refers not only to images of the physical body, but also to any sense of fragmentation and disunity. He, the subject, is originally an inchoate collection of desires. There you have the true sense of the expression fragmented body. Any such sense of disunity threatens the illusion of synthesis, which constitutes the ego. Lacan also uses the idea of the fragmented body to explain certain typical symptoms of hysteria. When a hysterical paralysis affects a limb, it does not respect the physiological structure of the nervous system, but instead reflects the way the body is divided up by an imaginary anatomy. In this way, the fragmented body is revealed at the organic level in the lines of fragilization that defined the anatomy of fantasy as exhibited in the schizoid and spasmodic symptoms of hysteria. Freud returned to. Freud retourne à. The whole of Lacan's work can only be understood within the context of the intellectual and theoretical legacy of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Lacan first trained as a psychoanalyst within the International Psychoanalytical Association, IPA, the organization founded by Freud, which presented itself as the sole legitimate heir to the Freudian legacy. However, Lacan gradually began to develop a radical critique of the way that most analysts in the IPA had interpreted Freud. After being expelled from the IPA in 1953, Lacan developed his polemic further, arguing that Freud's radical insights had been universally betrayed by the three major schools of psychoanalysis within the IPA: ego psychology, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and object relations theory. To remedy this situation, Lacan proposed to lead a return to Freud, both in the sense of a renewed attention to the actual texts of Freud himself and a return to the essence of Freud's work, which had been betrayed by the IPA. Reading Freud in the original German allowed Lacan to discover elements which had been obscured by poor translation and ignored by other commentators. Thus much of Lacan's work is taken up with detailed textual commentaries on specific works by Freud and by numerous references to the work of other analysts whose ideas Lacan refutes. To understand Lacan's work, therefore, it is necessary both to have a detailed understanding of Freud's ideas and also a grasp of the way these ideas were developed and modified by other analysts, the post-Freudians, whom Lacan criticizes. These ideas are the background against which Lacan develops his own return to Freud. What such a return to Freud involves for me is not a return of the repressed, but rather taking the antithesis constituted by the phase in the history of the psychoanalytic movement since the death of Freud, showing what psychoanalysis is not, and seeking with you the means of revitalizing that which has continued to sustain it, even in deviation. However, Lacan's work itself puts in question the narrative of a return to orthodoxy implicit in the expression return to Freud, for Lacan's way of reading Freud and his style of presentation are so original that they seem to belie his modest claims to be a mere commentator. Furthermore, while it is true that Lacan returns to the actual texts of Freud himself, it is also true that Lacan returns to specific aspects of the Freudian conceptual legacy, privileging particular concepts at the expense of others. It might be argued then that Lacan is no more faithful to Freud's work than the post-Freudians whom he criticizes for having betrayed Freud's message. Like them, Lacan selects and develops certain themes in Freud's work and neglects or reinterprets them. Or reinterprets others. Lacanian psychoanalysis might therefore be described as a post-Freudian form of psychoanalysis along with ego psychology, Kleinem psychoanalysis, and object relations theory. However, this is not the way Lacan sees his work. Lacan argues that there is a deeper logic at work in Freud's texts, a logic which endows those texts with a consistency despite the apparent contradictions. Lacan claims that his reading of Freud, and his alone, brings out this logic and shows us that the different stages and changes in direction in Freud's work are governed by Freud's inflexibly effective concern to maintain it in its primary rigor. In other words, while Lacan's reading of Freud might be as partial as any other in the sense that it privileges particular aspects of Freud's work, this is not, in Lacan's view, justification for regarding all interpretations of Freud as equally valid. Thus, Lacan's declarations of loyalty and accusations of betrayal cannot be seen as a mere rhetorical strategy. Certainly they do have a rhetorico-political function in that presenting himself as more Freudian than anyone else allowed Lacan to challenge the effective monopoly on the Freudian legacy that the IPA still enjoyed in the 1950s. However, Lacan's statements are also an explicit claim to have teased out a coherent logic in Freud's writings that no one else had perceived before. Frustration. The English term frustration came into increasing prominence in certain branches of psychoanalytic theory in the 1950s, together with a shift in emphasis from the Oedipal triangle to the mother-child relation. In this context, frustration was generally understood as the act whereby the mother, denies the child the object which would satisfy one of its biological needs. To frustrate a child in this way was thought by some analysts to be a major factor in the etiology of neurosis. Frustration is also the term which the Standard Edition uses to translate Freud's term Versagung. While this term is not extremely prominent in Freud's work, it does form part of his theoretical vocabulary. At a first glance, indeed, it may appear that Freud discusses frustration in the way described above. For example, he certainly attributes to frustration an important place in the etiology of symptoms, stating that it was a frustration that made the patient ill. Hence, when Lacan argues that the term frustration is quite simply absent from Freud's work, what he means is that the Freudian concept of Versagung does not correspond to the concept of frustration as described in the above paragraph. Lacan argues that those who have theorized the concept of frustration in this way have, by deviating from Freud's work, led psychoanalytic theory into a series of impasses. Thus, in the seminar of 1956-1957, he seeks a way of reformulating the concept in accordance with the logic of Freudian theory. Lacan begins by classifying frustration as one of the three types of lack of object, distinct from both castration and privation, see lack. Although he concedes that frustration is at the heart of the primary relations between mother and child, he argues that frustration does not concern biological needs, but the demand for love. This is not to say that frustration has nothing to do with a real object capable of satisfying a need, for example a breast or a feeding bottle. On the contrary, such an object is certainly involved, at least at first. However, what is important is that the real function of this object to satisfy a need, such as hunger, is soon completely overshadowed by its symbolic function, namely the fact that it functions as a symbol of the mother's love. The object is thus valued for being a symbolic gift. The object is thus valued more for being a symbolic gift than for its capacity to satisfy a need. As a gift, it is inscribed in the symbolic network of laws which regulate the circuit of exchanges, and thus seen as something to which the subject has a legitimate claim. Frustration, properly speaking, can only occur in the context of this legal order, and thus when the object which the infant demands is not provided, one can only speak of frustration when the infant senses that it has been wronged. In such a case, when the object is eventually provided, the sense of wrong, of broken promises, of love withheld, persists in the child, who then consoles himself for this by enjoying the sensations which follow the satisfaction of the original need. Thus, far from frustration involving the failure to satisfy a biological need, it often involves precisely the opposite. A biological need is satisfied as a vain attempt to compensate for the true frustration, which is the refusal of love. Frustration plays an important role in psychoanalytic treatment. Freud noted that to the extent that distressing symptoms disappear as the treatment progresses, the patient's motivation to continue the treatment tends to diminish accordingly. In order, therefore, to avoid the risk of the patient losing motivation altogether and breaking off the treatment prematurely, Freud recommended that the analyst must reinstate the patient's suffering elsewhere in the form of some appreciable privation. This technical advice is generally known as the rule of abstinence and implies that the analyst must continually frustrate the patient by refusing to gratify his demands for love. In this way, the patient's needs and longings should be allowed to persist in her in order to serve as forces impelling her to do work and to make changes. While Lacan agrees with Freud that the analyst must not gratify the analysant's demand for love, he argues that this act of frustration is not to be seen as an end in itself. Rather, frustration must be seen simply as a means to enable the signifiers of previous demands to appear. The analyst is he who supports the demand, not, as has been said, to frustrate the subject, but in order to allow the signifiers in which his frustration is bound up to reappear. The aim of the analyst is, by supporting the analysant's demands in a state of frustration, to go beyond demand and cause the analysant's desire to appear. Lacan differs from Freud in the way he theorizes the rule of abstinence. For Freud, the rule of abstinence primarily concerned the analysant's abstinence from sexual activity. If a patient implores the analyst to make love to her, the analyst must frustrate her by refusing to do so. While Lacan agrees with this advice, he stresses that there is a much more common demand that the analyst can also frustrate, the analysant's demand for a reply. The analysant expects the analyst to follow the rules of everyday conversation. By refusing to follow these rules, remaining silent when the analysant asks a question, or taking the analysant's words in a way other than that in which they were intended, the analyst has a powerful means at his disposal for frustrating the analysant. There is another way that the analyst frustrates the analysant, which Lacan mentions in 1961. This is the analyst's refusal to give the signal of anxiety to the analysant. The absence of anxiety in the analyst at all times, even when the analysant demands that the analyst experience anxiety. Lacan suggests that this may be the most fruitful of all forms of frustration in psychoanalytic treatment.